of all of the issues out in the international system, and this includes the disintegration of China and what's going on in Ukraine, it is our relationship with Mexico that was going to determine the health, the wealth, and the security of the American citizens moving forward for decades. Mexico is our #1 trading partner, and it is also the vector by which we absorb cocaine into this country. So we have set up a situation where all of our interests align and are being dealt with in a very, very bad manner. Not just by this administration, but by the previous one, and the one before that, and the one before that, and the one before that. This is not a new problem. Economics of drugs. It's obviously about the cocaine. I mean, it's like you can put $500,000 of product in your backpack. Of course it's about the cocaine. And because it has a very high value to cost, it is very easy to smuggle. And so it doesn't really matter if you have a wall, because somebody with a backpack will just hop it and make themselves very, very wealthy very, very quickly. But once you get cocaine, you then are left with a big fistful of cash, and you can't exactly put it in the local credit union. So what happens is the cartels try to get into businesses where there's a fair amount of cash that flows through them. So agricultural harvesting or processing are relatively popular, as are things like real estate and rental properties. They're big fans of bars. What they do is they try to get a facility that has a lot of cash flow through, and then they just feed some of their drug profits through it and report it as income, and then it can get laundered and into the financial system at large. And in Mexico and in the United States, this has brought them into things like avocado and lime production. This has brought them into tourism. This has brought them into real estate rentals, up to and including just like, residential real estate, multifamily housing. The more you do this in a community, the more you start distorting the local economic environment. And that means you have to put another layer into it, and you have to get into the political elite. And that means going into universities, going into institutions, going to the local government and buying them off so that the tax man doesn't look too close at the books. And this is how you kind of hollow out systems from the inside. And this is one of the things that Sinaloa under El Chapo started to do in places like rural Texas, because it allowed him to get a foothold north of the border. South of the border, there is not a city in which this has not happened to some degree, but it's really, really popular in agricultural regions and places where tourism was really strong, like in the Yucatan Peninsula or in Cabo. Now, once a cartel reaches a certain point, they have enough resources, they can reach up and down the supply chain. If you go north into the United States, you go out and you start interfacing with the drug infrastructure for distribution, and that takes you head to head with a lot of the gangs that you either co-opt or kill. If you go the other direction, you go up into Colombia and Bolivia and Ecuador, and you wipe out the local organized crime groups that do the first step smuggling, and you start interfacing with the producers of the stuff itself, and you start establishing a paramilitary presence in places like Colombia and Peru and Bolivia. In this case, the Sinaloa has far been the most successful at doing all of that. So we've got a transnational network that spans a half a dozen to a dozen countries in order to bring us our cocaine. And again, the solution here is very, very simple. Don't do cocaine. One more thing. I live in Colorado, and one of the things that Colorado has discovered in recent years is that they had a problem with processing the profits. So it used to be that in Colorado, you would basically have a giant walk-in safe because you couldn't put your money in the bank, you couldn't put it in a credit union, which meant that everybody had all this cash lying around, and these dispensaries were paying for everything in cash. Well, the Federal Reserve was like, whoa, that's a crime issue. So what we're going to do is we're going to send armored trucks to all of these dispensaries. We're going to pick up their cash. We're going to bring it out. We're going to iron it out and Febreze the crap out of it so it doesn't smell like pot anymore. And then we're going to make an electronic deposit into your account on behalf of the Federal Reserve. So no muss, no fuss. Well, the Sinaloa hears about this and like, whoa. Let me get this straight. The U.S. Federal Reserve is now in the business of laundering drug money. Sign us up. And so there's a lot of this cannabis supply chain in Colorado that has been bought up on all cash offers and is de facto owned by the Sinaloa cartel. So no easy fixes aside from don't do cocaine.
Mexican geography is wretched. From an economic and political point of view, the country is far more fractured than even what the Canadians have had to contend with. Mexico has no navigable rivers whatsoever. Whereas Canada is too cold, Mexico is too hot. Much of its territory is fully tropical or hard desert. Worse, nearly all of Mexico, whether temperate, jungle, or desert, is mountainous as well. Cut any way, this is a bad place to start down the road to civilization and stability. High heat and humidity exacts a constant toll on infrastructure from roads to buildings. Maintenance costs tend toward the extreme because builders must choose between having to replace everything more often or using different and more expensive materials in construction. Then there is the simple fact that the basic technologies of modern road building, the use of heavy machinery and the drying of concrete, are rather hard to manage in a downpour. Asphalt softens on a hot day, and the tropics have hot to spare. Tropical soils are very thin and shallow, only retaining their fertility when they are part of a natural biome. That fertility comes from the constant recycling of a jungle's myriad plant species, and the process of clearing land for agriculture guts the cycle. Former jungles and rainforest lands, therefore, require constant fertilization to maintain agricultural production, and if surrounding jungle lands are not cleared as well, then heavy pesticide use is a must, raising costs further, even as water quality declines. Often the tropics boast higher annual production totals per acre than temperate climes, because the heat and sun of the tropics frequently support more than one crop cycle a year. But that increased output comes at the cost of radically increased inputs. So more foodstuffs, yes, but the overall production is generally among the least efficient in the world. There are very few places on Earth where those farming the former jungle are not mired in poverty, and Mexico is no exception. Higher elevation mitigates heat and humidity, soil fertility has higher potential, and the cooler temperatures and thinner air work against diseases and their vectors. Most of Mexico's population and all but 4 of its major cities are nestled in the multitude of plateaus, highland basins, and mountain valleys throughout the country's midsection, where the elevation lifts the land out of the tropics into a more temperate environment. But that simply replaces the tropical challenge with a mountain challenge, which in many ways is just as onerous. Mountains, by definition, don't sport large tracts of flat land. There is no Mexican equivalent of the American Midwest that has the ability to generate scads of capital or support massive populations. Unlike other locations in North America, not one Mexican urban region has a hinterland. Any infrastructure that benefits one region cannot be extended to synergize with another. It must be rebuilt in each and every region without contributing to a greater whole. Mexico isn't split into 5 sections like Canada, but instead dozens, most of which cannot independently generate meaningful economies of scale. By far, Mexico's largest highland enclave is the greater Mexico City metropolitan area, home to 1 in 5 Mexicans and built on landfill. It isn't so much a good location as it is the best that the Mexican geography has on offer. Beyond Mexico City, only 10 Mexican metro areas pass the 1 million mark. The United States has 55. And none of them break 5 million. The United States has 10. The economies of scale, abundant capital, and ease of development that the Americans take for granted and that make industrialization possible are all absent in Mexico. Transport, always the difficulty of the human condition, is more onerous in mountains than in any other terrain. Sharp elevation changes generate swift currents, meaning that not one of Mexico's rivers is navigable, naturally or otherwise. The Mexico core region of Mexico City sits at an elevation of about 8,000 feet, despite being only 200 miles inland. Even when Mexico's disassociated regions manage to construct some local infrastructure, links between those regions require tackling topographic verticality that is painfully daunting not just to build but also to operate. Organic consumption growth is nearly impossible because what little capital there is must be dedicated to infrastructure. But even then, basic internal distribution is nearly impossible because of the extreme operating costs. It is a recipe for disconnected poverty and fractured, ineffectual government. Such difficult terrain skews what development that can happen into decidedly inegalitarian directions. This isn't the American riverine Midwest, with low barriers to entry and cheap long-distance transport options. In Mexico, the only people who can make a serious go are those who already have capital to spare. Those who could afford to build the expensive road and rail necessary to link a middling patch of useful land to the coast. Those who could afford to pay workers for months or even years to clear and fertilize land so that it might one day support crops. Most Mexican territory requires irrigation, further increasing the gap between those with capital and those without. Even the climate works against economic liberty. Tropical plantation crops like bananas and coffee require a great deal of capital to establish and a mammoth amount of unskilled labor throughout the crop's life cycles to tend, harvest, and ship.